The way in which television has reached the masses has changed over time, and will continue to change over time. People used to watch linear, or traditional television with a predetermined airing schedule until about 2 decades ago when streaming came around. And with all the talk of streaming services lately, it might seem like streaming has been more popular than linear television for a while, but that's not actually true. According to Nielsen, the first time that streaming overtook traditional television was May 2025. It's not like streaming overtook linear television permanently in May 2025. We're likely to see a lot of back and forth between linear and streaming being the most popular within the next few years. And what's really interesting is that Netflix is not actually the most popular streaming service. So join me as we explore the rise and fall of linear television and how streaming might have a little ways to go before becoming the top dog. A brief history of television. Television, according to Britannica, is a form of mass media based on the electronic delivery of moving images and sound from a source to a receiver. I actually don't need to go that far back in the history section. We all know what a TV is. The first regular television broadcast began on November 2nd, 1936 from the BBC. There'd been some dabbling in television broadcasts before, but this was the first time that a corporation committed to doing the television thing for real. The first show that the BBC aired had a grand total of 400 viewers, and the BBC did not launch into like a 24/7 type of deal. Their daily schedule became as follows: a program from 3 to 4 p.m., a break, a program from 9 to 10 p.m., and then a break until 3 p.m. the next day. They had 22 hours of breaks in between programs to avoid eye strain for the viewers, which, I mean, if the people from 1936 could see my screen time now, they'd be questioning a lot about my eye strain. But the BBC's scheduled 3 to 4, 9 to 10 programming blocks gave birth to linear television. Linear television, generally speaking, is when a program is delivered at a predetermined time by a network. It's programming on a set schedule, if you will, which differs from streaming, which is, generally speaking, the digital distribution of television, where you watch what you want, when you want. During the early days of television and up until the last few decades, linear television was the only way to go because technology. On-demand streaming television depends on the internet, which hadn't been invented yet. Television was introduced to the world at large at the 1939 World's Fair, and the world learned about the inventions there. Television on the rise. It took a few years for television to really catch on with the American public. In 1950, 9% of American households had televisions. By 1955, that was 50%, and by 1960, 90% of American homes had a television. Early television was initially centered around broadcast channels: ABC, CBS, and NBC, and later PBS. There were a lot of squeaky clean programs from these networks because anyone could technically access them, and therefore they needed to be appropriate for everybody, which I discussed in my video about American television ratings if that interests you. But the limitations of television technology at the time led to the future of television: cable television. Early television stations would send out electromagnetic signals over airwaves from the top of towers, which antennas could pick up on at people's homes, which transformed those signals into television programming. These towers could only send out the signals so far, and that was a problem if you did not live near a TV tower. So let's say you didn't live near a tower back in the day. How were you supposed to keep up with I Love Lucy? Community antenna television had physical cables that ran from towers to people's houses so they could receive the programming. During the first 30 years of cable was only used to transmit signal to areas where towers couldn't reach. But there was a lot of FCC regulation, and the FCC maintained a tight grip on the cable industry until about the 1970s. But something happened around the 1970s and 80s. Previous networks were kind of for mass audiences, but with cable, companies realized that they could make very specific niche television stations and have channels that were intended for specific audiences delivered to them individually via cable technology. Enter HBO in 1972, the first pay network. With early cable television, as it later became known, it wasn't like people paid for bundles of channels. With something like HBO, they only paid for HBO. The FCC deregulated cable in 1974, with another major deregulation in 1984, which really sparked the growth of cable television. Between satellites and television, much of cable, as it became known as, grew in popularity. From changes with individual pay-to-watch channels to channels being grouped together in bundles, additional cable networks came onto the scene, and cable TV gained a reputation for being expensive. Regardless if shows were on a free-to-watch network or on cable, television shows were still on a linear schedule. You had to tune in at an exact time to see an exact episode of an exact show. The network aired what they aired, and it was up to you to decide if you watched it. And commercials were abundant. For every half hour of television shown, about 21 minutes were devoted to the actual program itself, and the other 9 were devoted to other programming. Other programming being commercials or network promotion. And cable TV for many did get expensive, but people were still paying for cable television because what else were they gonna do? Just watch the free-to-watch network programs? No. The expense of cable and the rigidness of linear television laid the framework for streaming, but the origins of streaming are probably not exactly what you think. The rise of streaming. There was some dabbling with streaming in the late 90s and early 2000s on the internet, but it wasn't enough to really make an impact. But the true beginning of streaming services started in 2005 with the launch of YouTube. YouTube presented the ability for people to watch videos on demand. Videos were typically self-published, and not like the typical television shows on TV. But YouTube developed a public appetite for streaming videos. Netflix at the time was a service that sent people movies and TV shows in the mail, kind of like a mail-in Blockbuster. And according to the Michigan Journal of Economics, YouTube's streaming model is what convinced Netflix to start streaming movies and TV shows in 2007. And thus, traditional streaming services were born. Early streaming services offered advantages compared to linear television. Consumers could watch what they wanted, when they wanted. For the most part, there weren't any commercial breaks. And with the low number of streaming services that housed an incredibly robust amount of media, it was often more convenient and cost-effective to watch things on streaming. I mean, you can contrast that to now when there's a million streaming services and they're all raising their prices, and now they're introducing ad-supported tiers? So what exactly happened to streaming? Why was it so convenient at first, and why is it so not now? And is streaming still growing? A new phenomenon emerged as these early streaming services gained popularity called cord cutting. People started to cancel their cable subscriptions, only having access to public channels and streaming services. It wasn't like cord cutting swept through society immediately. There was a big prohibiting factor: the internet. Many people got their internet and cable as part of one package, and they might have had their landline thrown in with the deal. 35 million Americans have never had cable at all throughout the entirety of their lives, and they're not called cord cutters, they're called cord nevers. 52% of cord cutters don't miss anything at all, but 23% miss live sports and 22% miss news broadcasts. At first, streaming services largely focused on being a library for linear television shows and movies. But as years progressed, streaming services had ideas on how to differentiate themselves from their competition: original programming. The first major original streaming show, House of Cards, was released by Netflix in 2013. House of Cards was a major hit, and other streaming services began producing their own original content too. Original content is expensive, and profit margins for a lot of streaming services are reported to be pretty thin. And according to Nielsen, only 20% of viewers' time on streaming services is spent watching original content. So why do streaming services invest so much in them? Originals versus the backlog. Traditional television used to air a new episode of something, usually once a week. Sometimes these shows have okay viewership numbers for their original networks, but when these traditionally aired shows are put on streaming services after the fact, where people can watch entire seasons at once, shows sometimes have a big spike in popularity. This has been dubbed the Netflix effect. Even if this doesn't actually take place on Netflix, shows that experience the Netflix effect include Riverdale, which did okay on the CW, but received a huge viewership surge when Netflix acquired it. You, which was canceled on Lifetime after the first season, but became a huge hit when Netflix picked it up for more seasons. And Suits, which did okay on the USA Network, but broke streaming records when Netflix obtained it. But here's something else interesting. According to Harvard Business Review, if a streaming service obtained rights for someone's favorite network TV show, that usually didn't make them subscribe to the streaming service. Steve Hasker, Netflix chief operating officer, told Media Village, what's driving subscriptions and renewals may be the originals, but our research shows that most of the viewing time is spent with catalog programming. So, even though people don't tend to watch a lot of originals when they're on a streaming service, the originals get them to subscribe and to stay subscribed. Originals are all about the returns, even though they tend to be expensive to produce. But that also brings up an interesting question. Are streaming services actually profitable? Because ad-supported streaming service tiers have been introduced recently, and is that out of greed or out of survival? Ad-supported tiers. According to The Hollywood Reporter, streaming services have lower profit margins if they do not show commercials during their programming, even if a user is paying more to not have commercials. Instead, the profit margin per user is better if somebody is paying for a cheaper ad-supported tier versus a more expensive commercial-free tier. Therefore, it's actually preferable for the streaming services if you are an ad-supported tier customer versus a customer who does not have ads. And people seem to be interested in that too. Hub Research says that 60% of American consumers would subscribe to an ad-supported tier versus an ad-free tier if they could save $4 to $5 a month. So for the most part, it's a win-win for consumers and streaming services to have ad-supported tiers, because the commercial-free streaming model hasn't really been that profitable for any streaming service except for Netflix. We're kind of in this weird era at the time of this video that what worked before, as in showing ads every few minutes, seemed to be a proven profitability model for television, and a lot of streaming services are wanting to return to that. So like it or not, ad-supported tiers might be the way of the future. And who knows, maybe they'll get rid of ad-free tiers completely. Linear versus streaming in the modern era. According to Nielsen, the second most popular streaming service is Netflix, and the first most popular is YouTube. Just because much of its content is user-generated as opposed to studio-produced doesn't make it any less of a streaming service. It's just a bit different from the other streaming services. Has YouTube always been the top streamer? No. Will it always be? We'll just have to see. There's a battle between linear and streaming to see who's the most popular format of television viewing, and they could go back and forth for a while. But how could linear television overtake streaming again? And why could there be some back and forth in the future? A lot of shows that air on linear television take a break in the summer, but when they start up again, a lot of people tend to shift their focus away from streaming services and back towards linear television with scheduled programming. That and live sports. Sports, depending on the sport, air at a very specific time of the year. You can watch sports games after the fact, but that's not the vibe. You want to watch it live and you want to know what's happening right then. And live sports attract a lot of viewers towards linear television. The question of streaming becoming the more popular option is not a if question, but a when question, because based on the trajectory, it's going to happen. It's not just like the way that we watch television has changed over time. The type of shows on television have changed over time too. Earlier television shows were squeaky clean because everybody could access them. But when certain audiences could be excluded from certain shows because you had to opt into a network via cable, things began to change, and things could get a little bit saucy. If you want to know about the history of television ratings in the United States, please click on this video next. And thank you so much for watching.